Hi guys and welcome back. My plan for today's video was to paint up the new Ruic box, or at least get it started. But then I saw this piranha that was sitting on my desk that I assembled about a month ago and never got round to painting. So I thought, let's just get that out of the way first. But this time I'm going to be doing it a little bit different from my other Tau models. This time I'm going to be using the Army Painter Fanatics range instead of my previous colours. And I'm also going to be switching up the accent colour from the yellow and switching it to magenta, which I kind of fell in love with in my last Eldari video, so I thought I'd give it a try with the Tau and see how that looks. So let's get into it. The first step is we're going to be spraying the entire model with deep grey, or really any dark grey of your choosing. The point is here, we're just trying to get rid of the majority of the black primer. So you just really want to spray the model from all angles, try to cover roughly 90-95% of the model in this colour, just leaving the kind of primer in the deepest of recesses. And when it comes to the paint and how thin it should be while spraying it through the airbrush, it's really up to you what you prefer, but I personally prefer to work as close to water consistency as I can. This does mean you normally have to do a few more coats than if you were using a thicker paint. But working in this really thin consistency almost eliminates any possibility of your airbrush clogging and of your tip drying on the end of your needle. It does mean that you have to be very light with the trigger, as any overspray with the airbrush will cause a lot of spidering, and that's when the kind of paint doesn't adhere to the model and just gets pushed along the surface in a kind of spider web pattern. But once you get the hang of it, it makes airbrushing fun, as you don't have to spend any time unclogging dried paint from the tip, or even worse, in the barrel of the airbrush itself. Once that's dried, we're going to start to build up all of the highlights on all of the armour plates on the model. And we're going to start off first with Night Sky, which is from the desaturated blue-grey triad. And as this model is very flat from the top and has a lot of flat surfaces, I decided I was going to bring the majority of the highlights towards the back of the model. So I was trying to kind of focus more of my sprays towards the back of the wings and the main body of the model as well. But in general, you want to cover roughly around 75% of the model in this colour, just trying to leave some of the grey in the shadow areas. And again, if you're like me and you're working with very thin paint, just make sure you're making multiple passes to try and build up the colour. The next highlight layer is going to be of Ruic Cobalt. And again, we're just working our way up the triad, brightening up all of the highlights over a smaller surface area. And just like the previous step, I'm trying to push as much of the highlights as I can towards the back of the model, and just applying spot highlights to any of the other areas I want to highlight as well. And in general, I would say I covered around 50% of the model in this colour. The final armour highlight layer is going to be of pure white, and I prefer to use white ink for this, purely because inks don't need thin down at all, you can just use them straight out of the bottle, so I'll generally use an ink if there's an opportunity to. And as this is our final highlight, we only really want to be applying this to the top areas of any of the highlight areas. And in general, you don't want to cover any more than, I'd say, about 25% of the model with this step. And the final step before we start to apply the weathering pigment will be to paint in all of the metallic areas on the model. And to do this, you can really use any metallic colour you wish. I went for Army Painter Fanatics Gunmetal, but honestly any dark metallic colour would do here. And I just applied one coat of this to any of the areas that I wanted to be metallic. And in general, that was any of the areas on the box art that were painted in black. But there's no real kind of hard and fast rule here on what should be and what shouldn't be metallic. You can just pick what you want and paint that in your metallic paint of choice. Next up, it's time to try and add some shade to the model, and as usual I'm going to be using my Mr. Weathering Multi-Black Pigment. And like the rest of my Tau models, I'm going to be using this undiluted, straight up out of the bottle. And I'm just going to be using a large brush to apply this to every part of the model. And don't forget that you will need to apply a coat of some kind of varnish first and allow it to cure for at least overnight before you apply this weathering pigment, as the solvent sometimes can strip the model. It's never happened to any of my Tau models, but it did happen to one of my Eldari models when I didn't use any varnish at all. So I just use a little bit of matte varnish now, and that seems to protect it well enough. Next up, it's time to go in with the Mr. Weathering solvent. And to do that, you just need to make sure you clean off your brush, and then get a little bit of the solvent on your clean brush, and then start to wipe away all of the pigment on the model. And when you apply the solvent to the model, this should reactivate the weathering pigment, and that will allow you to move the pigment around the model and wick it off where needed, and then wipe it off onto a paper towel. And you just need to keep repeating this process all around the model, paying specific attention to all of the previous areas that we highlighted up the brightest, so really most of the areas towards the back of the model. And the more you use it, the more the highlights will be uncovered on the model. And just remember, the key here is to keep wicking your brush on a paper towel, as your brush will fill up with the pigment rather quickly. And if you don't wipe it off on the paper towel, you'll just be moving the pigment around rather than actually removing it from the model. And this is especially true for any of the really flat areas on the model, especially the wings, as there's not really too many places for the pigment to actually go, so you really need to make sure you're wicking off as much of that excess pigment from the wings as you can. Once that's dried, it will require a coat of matte varnish to take away some of the shine from the weathering pigment. However, I'm not going to do that just yet. I'm first of all going to paint in all of the accent colours. And to do that, I'm going to be using all 6 of the colours from the Army Painter Fanatics Magenta Triad. And the first step in this process will be to use Diabolic Plum to paint in any of the areas on the model that you want to be in this accent colour. And in which parts you put the accent colours on the model is really up to you. I've just picked a few places that I normally picked in my current Tau army. I just really regret making the choice of painting the rest of my Tau army with yellow accents. I think the magenta looks much better, and I'm also switching away from using contrast paints as well. as I found that the results with contrast paints were inconsistent at best. So we're just going to be doing some good old-fashioned layering and seeing where that gets us. Next, I'm just going to start working my way down the triad, applying each colour in sequence, but each time that I take a step down in brightness, I'll cover less and less of a surface area. That way we'll be building up this nice bright magenta colour, which is also nicely shaded as well with the kind of deep purple plum colour. And I'm not even doing any glazing here, I'm just using these paints on the wet palette, so there is a little bit of moisture from the wet palette, but I'm just straight up layering these and not bothering to mix in any water. If you did mix in water, you would get a much smoother transition, but it would require applying multiple coats. And for this model, I just wanted to test out the layering, as I've only just purchased the Army Painter Fanatics paints, and I just want to test out what they can do. In future videos, I will be doing more tests with glazing and other techniques, but as I said, for now, we're just going to be applying some basic layering. And because there's so many colours, i.e. 6 colours in each triad, I found that the colours are so closely matched to each other that just using some basic layering techniques actually gives you quite a smooth blend as is. So I'm actually quite looking forward to trying out some glazing with these paints and seeing what they can really do. So far I'm really liking these paints and not regretting the purchase at all. They've been working really well so far, both with the brush and the airbrush. And to me, the best part of the paint range is the 6 colour triad system. It really takes all of the guesswork out of picking colours and knowing which colours to use to highlight. And the range is so extensive that it's just really helped me in general with all of my colour selection. And if you're not really an artistic person, like myself, colour choices can be difficult, and I just find that it tremendously helps my confidence when it comes to that. And I do highly recommend them, so if you are looking for a new paint range, you should definitely check them out. And now that the accent colours have been complete, and I've given the model a quick blast with matte varnish, the model is pretty much complete, and I am very happy with the magenta transitions, even though I use these paints pretty much straight out of the bottle. It's already a huge improvement on just using contrast paints themselves. And the magenta for sure looks better than the yellow. I'm not sure exactly what I was thinking when I went with the yellow, but you live and you learn. And for the basing, I stuck with my Tau crystal bases, but as I already went with magenta as my accent colour, this time I'm going to go with a nice vivid blue for my crystals. And the last thing I did before doing the base was just apply a quick edge highlight of shining silver to all of the metallic parts on the model. And that's the model complete. And once the base dries and is ready to be primed, I'll get that painted up. And if you want to see how I do my Tau crystal bases, you can check out one of my previous Tau videos. Next up, I'm definitely tackling the Kroot hunting pack, and I've already seen on YouTube there are quite a lot of painting tutorials out there already, and from what I can see most of them are using a green skin tone, which is fairly standard. So I'm going to have to try and come up with something a little bit different and a little bit more special. And I've got a few ideas up my sleeve, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out. on that upcoming Kroot video. But anyway, as always, I hope you found this video useful, and if you did, let me know in the comments down below. But until next time, happy painting, and I'll see you in the next one.